They found it sealed beneath a half-collapsed vault where sand had slipped in like water through a cracked dam. A papyrus scroll, brittle but intact, tucked inside a stone box etched with a feather and crescent moon. It wasn't a mythological hymn. It wasn't a funerary rite. It was a record, a warning. And stamped along the margin was a name so old it predated the pyramids. Thoth, not just a scribe, not just a god, but a guardian. The scroll spoke of a library, one built before kings, before dynasties, holding truths the ancients feared and the modern world forgot. And then it vanished. Of course, stories like this rarely knock on your door. They arrive in fragments half-whispered through crumbling walls or hinted at in dusty catalogs no one's opened since the Cold War. So let's slow the pulse. Take a breath. The sands are shifting again. Picture a desert that hasn't changed in 5,000 years. Flat light stretches across limestone plateaus, and the wind moves like a memory. You're standing before a weather-worn ruin, its stones warm to the touch even at dusk. Above the lintel, faint carvings depict a strange, ibis-headed figure, not standing among gods, but a lone quill in hand, as if recording everything. No judgment, no praise. Just record-keeping, as though that alone were sacred. In Egyptian lore, Thoth was the moon's scribe, the keeper of divine balance, the one who wrote the world into order. But some believed he wasn't invented by the Egyptians. They thought the Egyptians inherited him. And if that's true, if there was once a real figure behind the myth, then who was he? And what knowledge did he guard so fiercely that temples rose in his name and secret societies whispered his prophecies across continents and centuries? Tonight, we follow that trail, from sunken ruins in Middle Egypt to the half-buried prophecies under the Sphinx's paw, from the scrolls of Hermopolis to the legends co-opted by the Greeks, the Templars, and even modern mystics. Along the way, we'll confront a question few dare to ask: what if Thoth wasn't the god of knowledge, but its last defense? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. It's hard to pin down a god's birthday, especially when that god seems older than time itself. But if you follow the ink trails backward past the familiar temples and into the soft clay records of the earliest Egyptian settlements, you'll find faint outlines, sketches, symbols, murmurs of something becoming Thoth before he had a name. In pre-dynastic Egypt, before Narmer unified the land, before hieroglyphs danced across tomb walls, there existed a reverence for cycles: moon, sun, stars, the flooding Nile. But one celestial presence stood apart: the moon, not as a goddess, but as an observer. Quiet, constant, marking the rhythm of things. And here perhaps is where Thoth began: less deity, more cosmic accountant. Unlike Ra, whose power blazed openly, or Osiris, whose myth gripped life and death, Thoth worked in the margins. He didn't command the skies. He measured them. He didn't rule over men. He recorded their fates. In the earliest religious texts, what we now call the pyramid texts, Thoth is invoked not for salvation, but for structure. His role was to balance the scales of Ma'at, to ensure that nothing tipped too far into chaos. He was the whisper behind justice, the reason spells were remembered, the logic behind ritual. In a world where the unknown meant death, his order meant survival. But his reach extended beyond bureaucratic tidiness. The Egyptians credited Thoth with the invention of language itself. To write, they believed, was to make memory permanent. And it wasn't merely about communicating, writing fixed reality. A spoken word vanished. A written one stayed. So Thoth became more than a god of script. He became the god who determined what was real. Every hieroglyph etched into stone was in some way an echo of his voice. Imagine the weight of that, every scribe, every priest holding a reed pen in trembling fingers, aware that each line could ripple across generations. Yet even this exaltation wasn't without shadows. In the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, a story from the Middle Kingdom, there's a subtle unease. The sailor speaks of a serpent, ancient and all-knowing, living on an island of treasure and guarded secrets. The serpent claims to have seen the fall of civilizations and warns of forgetting. While the tale never names Thoth directly, scholars have long speculated the creature symbolizes the old god's wisdom, hoarded, veiled, and potentially dangerous. Some scholars, like Jan Assmann, have argued that Thoth functioned as the first intellectual god in history, not one of brute power, but of preserved knowledge. That's what made him so unique. Most pantheons had gods of war, gods of fertility, gods of weather. But few had someone who watched, remembered, and crucially wrote it all down. It's almost unsettling. As if the Egyptians feared the past as much as they revered it and needed someone to keep it on a leash. And yet, was Thoth always Egyptian? There's a theory nestled deep in fringe academic circles that he didn't originate in the Nile Valley at all. Some claim his earliest forms come from Nubian ritual symbology, or even older Saharan cultures now lost to climate and time. The ibis, after all, was once a desert scavenger. Could the ibis-headed god have migrated into Egypt with knowledge systems carried from older vanished societies? The idea isn't popular in mainstream circles, but it's not entirely baseless. Oral traditions in Sudan speak of a moonkeeper who etched nighttime messages in stone, and even early Mesopotamian records reference a writing man who came from the west. Whatever his origin, Thoth's image crystallized by the time the Old Kingdom rose. By then, he was both scribe and magician, counterbalancing chaos through spell and scroll. He didn't strike enemies, he outwrote them. Even the gods deferred to him during disputes. When Isis wanted to resurrect Osiris, she turned not to might, but to Thoth's incantations. When Ra needed secrets sealed away, it was Thoth who designed the locks and the forgetting spells. And still, the mystery lingers. Why would a society so enthralled with glory and power give so much to a god who preferred shadows? Why carve his figure into tombs not as a protector, but as an auditor? Maybe because they feared memory more than death. Maybe because they knew forgetting was the real apocalypse. Which brings us back to that scroll found in the ruined vault, its language curiously older than other known texts, its form unlike anything in standard Egyptian archives. The ink formula still unidentifiable. The syntax skewed, almost as if mimicking Thoth's earliest unrefined grammar. The scroll doesn't tell us who Thoth was, but it tells us someone somewhere still remembered him. And they remembered him not as myth, but as witness. You're standing now on cracked limestone sun, low and hot behind your shoulders, looking over a scatter of broken columns and dust-choked stones. This is Hermopolis, though. What's left of it barely whispers that name anymore. Once called Kumunu in the Old Tongue, the City of Eight, it was sacred to Thoth above all others. Here, they said, the moon god chose to dwell not in the high temples of kings, but in the quiet shade of scholars. Hermopolis wasn't built to dazzle, it was built to remember. In the mythology, it's where the world began. 8 primordial beings, chaos embodied, swirled together in the waters of Nun. Then a lotus bloomed. Out of it rose the sun. And Thoth, witness to this first light, recorded the act of creation. The temple that once stood here was meant to mirror that cosmic moment. Its walls bore records, not just praises. It wasn't a church, it was a database. But try finding it now. You'd barely know the place unless you were looking. Most of the ruins are buried under the modern town of El Ashmunain. The temple of Thoth, called the House of the Moon, was dismantled stone by stone across the centuries. Some pieces were scavenged for mosques, others to build Ottoman fortresses. One gate, just a fragment, survives in the Cairo Museum, its carvings faded, but still bearing the ibis crest. The rest scattered, hidden, or lost beneath centuries of Nile silt and silence. And yet archaeologists keep returning here. Not just because of what's been found, but because of what hasn't. In 1962, a team uncovered a strange limestone shaft near the temple's northern edge. It led nowhere, just a sealed-off corridor carved with odd pictographs older than the temple itself. They weren't quite hieroglyphs. Some resembled the earliest proto-writing forms from pre-dynastic culture. Others didn't match any known Egyptian system. A few archaeologists whispered the word hoax, but couldn't explain how the layers of sediment above it dated back over 3 millennia. The shaft was quietly resealed. Funding was cut. The dig was abandoned. And then there's the curious case of the Hermopolis tablets. In 1894, a German collector claimed to have acquired 3 stone fragments inscribed with what he believed were excerpts from a lost Book of Thoth, supposedly dug up during early French explorations of the site. They described lunar rituals, astronomical alignments, and something called the Circuit of Memory, a process by which written words could anchor divine truths in physical space. Mainstream Egyptologists dismissed them as late-period forgeries, and 2 of the fragments vanished during World War II. The third now rests in a private collection in Prague. No one's been allowed to test it since 1987. Of course, it's hard to separate fact from legend here. The Greeks called this place Hermopolis because they believed Thoth was their Hermes, the messenger of gods. But they didn't just rename the city, they rewrote its purpose. Where the Egyptians had built quiet spaces for calculation and cosmic alignment, the Greeks imagined bustling oracles, libraries, and schools of mystery. Some ancient travel logs claim students came here from as far as Persia and Lydia to learn sacred geometry. But there's no clear record of what they studied. No scrolls, no archive, just a few odd reliefs of Thoth drawing spirals in sand and one half-burned papyrus that talks about the vault that hums. And here's where the story twists. In 1971, a French anthropologist working on a side survey in the area spoke to local elders who shared a peculiar folktale. They said the earth beneath Hermopolis shifts when the moon is full, that there are places goats won't walk, that under certain stars you can hear the scribes whisper, just wind, most would say. But these stories lined up uncannily with temple alignments first mapped during Napoleon's expedition. One corridor pointed not to the rising sun or Sirius typical Egyptian markers, but to the heliacal rising of the moon at the equinox, a Thothian clock ticking in stone. What does this mean? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. The scholars who still study Hermopolis, though few remain, propose that the temple wasn't just a place of worship, but a machine of sorts, a structure designed to store, preserve, and transmit information. The ancient Egyptians believed stone could hold memory, that sound and rhythm left impressions on matter. The idea that knowledge could be embedded into architecture, hidden in resonance light or geometric vibration, was not fantasy to them. It was theology. And if that's true, then what might still be buried here? What patterns still rest in the ruins? Some say the temple was only the visible part of something deeper. An underground chamber, a lunar archive, a place where truth was not merely written, but echoed. Remember that strange scroll from the vault, the one attributed to Thoth using a grammar even experts struggled to place. Its style resembled the forms found in the shaft wall, which raises the question no one wants to ask: what if the scroll didn't come from the surface temple, but from beneath it? Somewhere between the dust of history and the smoke of myth lies a book that no one has ever read, but that many have feared. The Book of Thoth. It sounds like a prop from a fantasy novel, and yet its name echoes through ancient papyri, Hellenistic grimoires, and Renaissance occult manuals with startling consistency. Descriptions vary, but they all agree on one thing: the Book of Thoth wasn't meant to be held by mortals. It was said to grant divine knowledge, secrets of the heavens, the underworld, language, magic, and even the structure of time itself. Powerful knowledge. Dangerous knowledge. The most detailed ancient reference comes from a demotic tale written sometime around the 2nd century BCE. In it, a priest named Neferkaptah discovers the book buried in a box of gold floating on the Nile. He opens it, he reads it, and then his life unravels. His wife dies, his son drowns, and Neferkaptah himself is cursed to spend eternity entombed with the book, guarding it in death as he had claimed it in life. The story has the pacing of a parable: don't take what isn't meant for you, but it also hides something else, a very specific map. The tale describes the box's coordinates using star alignments and Nile branch references that, while dated, can be roughly translated into physical geography. Several researchers in the 20th century attempted to trace it. None reported success. One never returned. Is the Book of Thoth real? Not likely, say most Egyptologists. At best, it's a metaphor, perhaps a poetic way of describing the collected ritual texts passed down through priesthoods. Yet there's an odd wrinkle. In 1828, a tomb near Tuna el Gebel was unearthed. Inside, among the usual funerary items, was a narrow scroll written in undeciphered glyphs wound around a piece of silver. The writing was not standard hieroglyphic, nor demotic, nor Greek. The ink contained rare compounds, including trace amounts of arsenic and crushed malachite, both known in ancient Egypt, but never together. Scholars called it a forgery. Still, the scroll vanished within a decade. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and suddenly the Book of Thoth reappears by name. Western alchemists referred to it as Liber Thoth, claiming it had survived in fragments disguised among Arabic manuscripts and Kabbalistic treatises. The Picatrix, an Islamic grimoire often accused of being dangerously close to sorcery, mentions a scribe of the moon whose pages burn the unworthy. In 1651, the mystic Athanasius Kircher tried to assemble what he believed were surviving pieces of Thoth's writings. His work culminated in a bizarre map, half Egyptian, half Babylonian, that pointed toward a lost city beneath the Libyan sands. Unsurprisingly, he was discredited. But even modern fiction can't resist the myth. From Lovecraft to comic books, the idea of a forbidden book that warps the mind of the reader has persisted. Why? Perhaps because the core idea is so old, so primal. The fear that knowledge might not enlighten but consume. That to read too deeply is to fall. And in Thoth's case, this fear came with ritual weight. Several temple walls, especially in Edfu, bear warnings against speaking certain names aloud. They refer to the language of the gods, the Medu Neter, and they hint that some sounds once uttered cannot be withdrawn. Could the Book of Thoth have been more than text? Could it have been vocal, a set of recitations so precise, so encoded, that they activated something? Even today, we don't fully understand the phonetic structures of Middle Egyptian. It's possible that reading a ritual aloud in the original cadence would be gibberish, or it might match exactly what a priest chanted beneath a full moon 4,000 years ago. That's the puzzle. That's the fear. Not just the meaning, but the sound of the book might matter. And there's one more haunting detail, something that loops us back to Hermopolis. In the shaft wall near the sealed corridor among those strange pictographs, one symbol repeats a feather over a flame flanked by two circles. That same motif appears in several alchemical texts, believed to reference the book. Not similar, identical. The implication, whoever carved that shaft knew of the book, or had seen it, or had copied it. We may never find a complete volume, of course. But fragments, hints, whispers. They've appeared in too many places too far apart to dismiss entirely. The scroll from Tuna el Gabel, the fragment in Prague, the stone panel that was quietly removed from Abydos and sold at auction with no provenance listed, all carrying variations of Thoth's glyph, all buried, all kept quiet. So fact or fiction may be the wrong question. Perhaps the Book of Thoth isn't a thing to find, but a thing to recognize, a blueprint scattered across time. Not a single object, but a network of ideas encoded into architecture, ritual, sound, and stone. And maybe, just maybe, the ones who truly feared it weren't the priests who locked it away, but the gods themselves. By the time the last pharaoh fell, Thoth had already begun wearing another man's face. He had changed languages, continents, and even his name. In the waning days of Egyptian autonomy, when Alexander the Great had swept through the Nile Valley like a divine wind, and Greek settlers began renaming cities like toys on a shelf, Thoth did not vanish. He adapted. The Greeks, peering into the strange animal-headed pantheon of Egypt, saw something familiar in Thoth, a god of language, a god of numbers, a god of hidden truths. So they called him Hermes, but not just Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. This fusion birthed something entirely new, not just a rebranded deity, but an entire corpus of mysterious writings, rituals, and teachings that would later be known as the Hermetica. Written in Greek but steeped in Egyptian mysticism, these texts claim to hold cosmic wisdom about the nature of the soul, the movement of stars, and the divine architecture of the universe. Unlike the structured priestly knowledge of old Egypt, these were dreamlike conversations between teacher and pupil god, and manlight and silence. And at the center of them all stood Hermes Trismegistus, equal parts philosopher, mage, and forgotten prophet. To the Greeks, Thoth was no longer merely a recorder. He became a revealer. And this shift tells us something vital about how knowledge was perceived across cultures. Egyptian wisdom had been priest-bound, encoded, hierarchical. Greek thought loved open speculation dialogue, the Socratic method. So when Thoth and Hermes merged, the result was something slippery, a god who both withheld and whispered. One who would show you a door but never open it for you. But who wrote the Hermetica that's still debated? Most scholars agree the surviving texts were composed between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE in Alexandria, a city where Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, and early Christian mystics all wandered the same alleys. Some believe they were written by Egyptian scribes trained in Greek rhetoric. Others suspect they were entirely Greek compositions, draped in exotic robes for spiritual effect. But one theory quietly held by a few scholars and fringe researchers suggests something stranger, that the Hermetica were based on now-lost Egyptian texts from Hermopolis itself. Texts written in the House of the Moon. Texts possibly tied to the Book of Thoth. The evidence, a curious papyrus in the Berlin Museum known as P. Beryl, 3008. It's a Greek Hermetic dialogue, but one that oddly mimics Egyptian spell structures, short lines, repetitive cadences, references to the circuit of the tongue and memory made flesh, phrases that echo the lunar rituals from the Hermopolis tablets mentioned earlier. and in the margin a drawing an ibis beside a scroll with no writing. Now skeptics dismiss this as poetic coincidence. But the motif of the ibis, Thoth's sacred animal, recurs again and again in Hermetic texts. One even claims Hermes Trismegistus once took flight over the pyramids, watching the stars align with buried chambers. Another describes a hall of writing beneath the desert floor. It's tempting to see these as symbolic. But what if they weren't? What if the Greeks didn't just inherit stories, they inherited locations? Here's a subtle but provocative clue. In the Asclepius, a later Hermetic text, Hermes laments the future of Egypt. He says the temples will fall, the gods will flee, and the sacred texts will be hidden in the deserts and caverns of the West. That sounds like metaphor. Until you remember that many early Coptic and Gnostic manuscripts like the Nag Hammadi library were literally found buried in Egyptian caves. One fragment, rarely discussed, bears a glyph resembling Thoth's lunar crest, tucked beneath a Hellenistic-style invocation. No translation has yet been agreed upon. Its ink is flaking. The parchment cracks when touched. And this is where things become delicate. Because if Hermes Trismegistus was in part a Hellenized Thoth, then the Hermetica may not just be Greek fantasies, they might be translations. Not from hieroglyphic texts directly, but from oral rituals, mnemonic formulas, even architectural memory systems, preserved by Egyptian priests under Greek rule. Priests who, when their temples were closed by Roman decree, fled with whatever fragments they could carry into monasteries' caves in silence. It's worth recalling that the last hieroglyph was carved in 394 CE. After that, the language died. Egypt forgot how to read itself. But the Hermetica lived on, copied, translated, adapted through Islamic philosophers, medieval alchemists, and Renaissance magicians. The words shifted, the meanings drifted, but the core idea endured, that a god once taught men how to write, how to reckon time, how to speak to the stars. So was Hermes Trismegistus real? Likely not. But was he based on someone real, some ancient priest, some visionary scribe, some fragment of Thoth's historical shadow? Maybe more importantly, could the texts attributed to him contain encoded remnants of lost Egyptian wisdom hidden beneath layers of Greek prose and Platonic metaphor? That's the haunting question. Because if the Hermetica are even partially faithful to older sources, then we may have been holding pieces of the Book of Thoth all along, without knowing how to read them. It starts, as these things often do, with a whisper, a voice not from a tomb, but from a trance. In 1932, an American man named Edgar Cayce lay back on a couch in Virginia Beach, closed his eyes and spoke in a low, steady voice about Atlantis' Egyptian temples and a hidden library buried beneath the Sphinx. He called it the Hall of Records. According to Cayce's visions, this chamber held the complete record of human civilization before the flood, Atlantean scrolls, celestial maps, and the true history of mankind's origins. And at the center of it all, Thoth, guardian, architect, gatekeeper. It's easy to roll your eyes. Cayce was, after all, a self-proclaimed psychic who claimed to access the Akashic records, a sort of cosmic hard drive floating somewhere in the ether. But what caught the attention of researchers wasn't just the content of his readings, it was how strangely they aligned with older Egyptian traditions, and how persistent the idea of a subterranean archive had been across time. Let's start with the Sphinx itself. For centuries it stood mute, a monument too old for even the ancient Egyptians to explain. There are no inscriptions on it, no formal record of who built it. And when Napoleon's scholars tried to chart its dimensions, they found signs of water erosion on its flanks. Strange considering it stands in the driest part of Egypt. Geologist Robert Schoch, later argued that this erosion suggested the Sphinx was thousands of years older than commonly accepted, perhaps dating back to 7000 BCE, long before the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, to whom it's usually attributed. And then there's the pause. In 1993, using ground-penetrating radar, a team led by Thomas Dobecki and John Anthony West discovered an unusual anomaly beneath the Sphinx's front paws, a rectangular void, symmetrical and seemingly artificial. They weren't allowed to excavate. Egyptian authorities, then under Zahi Hawass, refused citing preservation concerns. But photos and data from the survey circulated. To many, it was the physical proof that Casey's prophecy had a kernel of truth. There was a chamber. The question was, who built it, and what did it contain? Now, most Egyptologists argue the chamber is natural or unrelated. They point out that the Giza Plateau is riddled with cracks, tunnels, and old quarries. But skeptics point to curious inconsistencies. For example, in 1926, before Casey ever spoke of the Hall of Records, a team clearing sand near the Sphinx's rear discovered a small passageway that seemed to lead down but was blocked by rubble. Records of that dig exist only in fragments. Some notes were lost in the chaos of World War II. Others were curiously never published. And here's where Thoth returns to the scene, not as a distant deity, but as a practical architect. Ancient Egyptian texts repeatedly associate him with the House of Life, a term used to describe temple libraries. But certain texts, like the Edfu inscriptions, also speak of a first time, or Zep Tepi, when gods walked among men and sacred plans were hidden for the future. Thoth, in these accounts, is said to have sealed knowledge within the earth beneath the lion near the place of sunrise. Now, lions were sacred symbols of strength and time in Egyptian lore, but they were also literal. The Sphinx is a lion, and place of sunrise, that aligns with the Sphinx's orientation facing east. Too poetic to be proof, maybe, but too precise to ignore. Casey wasn't the only one to make the leap. In the mid-20th century, a mysterious figure named Paul Brunton claimed to have meditated inside a hidden chamber beneath the Giza Plateau, guided by a local mystic. He spoke of inscriptions glowing faintly in the dark, of a presence that watched but did not judge. He never named Thoth, but referred to the scribe who knows. And in one passage of his journal he writes, "Not all books are made of paper, some are built into the world." Whether metaphor or memory, the idea of a hidden archive persisted and inspired real action. In 1978, an independent expedition attempted to excavate near the Sphinx using new radar scans. The effort was halted by authorities within weeks. No formal reason was given. But a year later, under heavy sand cover, a fence was quietly constructed around the Sphinx's base. And no amateur team has worked that close since, which raises an uncomfortable question: if there's truly nothing there, why so much secrecy? Is it just bureaucratic red tape, national pride? Or is there something beneath the stone, something sealed, something guarded? Skeptics argue that stories like these, Casey's visions, Shoke's geology, Brunton's meditations, are just fantasy colliding with ancient awe. But there's one detail that sticks like grit in your teeth. The phrase Hall of Records doesn't appear in any known Egyptian source. It's Casey's invention. And yet, a 3rd century Greek manuscript discovered in Thebes refers to a lost chamber called the Library of He Who Counts, said to lie beneath the lion between the paws. That's not translation. That's precision. So is the Hall of Records real? Is Thoth truly its architect? We can't say for sure. But the convergence of myth, geography, architecture, and modern anomaly draws a tantalizing outline. An outline shaped like a god with the head of an ibis, who never blinked and never forgot. Picture a knight in white robes, red cross pressed to his chest, standing not on a battlefield, but inside a ruined temple, half buried in sand parchment unfurled in his hand, and a strange symbol carved into the stone behind him. Not a cross, not a sword, but an ibis. It's a romantic image. And like most romantic images, it's built from fragments, whispers, and the maddening absence of certainty. But the idea has persisted for centuries that the Knights Templar champions of Christendom once stumbled upon the remnants of something far older, far stranger, and left with more than treasure. That they found Thoth. Let's start with what we know. When the First Crusade took Jerusalem in 1099, the Templars followed shortly after establishing their headquarters on the Temple Mount itself, right above what had once been the ruins of Solomon's Temple. For 9 years, the order barely recruited, barely fought. Instead, they excavated. Quietly. Deliberately. Contemporary records are silent on what they searched for. But later legends, particularly from Arabic chroniclers, claim the Templars removed objects not made by men of this world. What does that mean? Gold relics or something more abstract, scrolls, symbols, blueprints? Among the more curious accounts is one attributed to Usama ibn Munkidh, a Syrian nobleman who recorded a strange encounter with Frankish knights who sought the ancient language of the stars. He didn't name the Templars specifically, but he did say they spent time not in churches, but in caves. Then there's the matter of the Templar codices. A number of 12th and 13th century manuscripts associated with the order, notably the Codex Bezae and the Liber de Perditis Scriptus, include obscure references to Egyptian symbols, the moon, the ibis, the eye. The latter text speaks of a tongue older than Babel and of a scribe who taught silence. This wasn't standard Christian theology. It was something else, something foreign. And here's where it gets interesting. Some believe the Templars encountered early Hermetic texts during their time in the Levant and brought them back to Europe repackaged in a Christian esoteric framework. This theory gained traction during the Renaissance, when occult thinkers like Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino began linking Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and Christian mysticism. They claimed the Templars had preserved fragments of Thoth's wisdom, disguised as sacred geometry and alchemical rites. Their proof murals in Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built by a Templar-connected family, contain carvings that match Egyptian motifs, including the stylized feather of Mayat and a curious depiction of an ibis-headed figure holding a stylus. Coincidence, perhaps, but there's more. In 1307, when the Templars were arrested en masse by the French crown, some were tortured into confessing heresies. One recurring accusation, that they worshipped a mysterious figure named Baphomet. Over the centuries, Baphomet has been interpreted in countless ways, but a minority of researchers suggest it's a corruption of Bahumat or Baphomet terms, possibly derived from Abu Fomut, a mangled Arabic reference to father of writing. Could this be a distorted memory of Thoth passed through languages and fear? And what of the Templar fleet? On the night of the arrests, a number of their ships vanished from La Rochelle, never to be seen again. Rumors abound. Some say they sailed to Scotland, others to Portugal. But a few suggest they took not gold, but knowledge. A chest, a box, a scroll case wrapped in waxed linen. There's no proof, of course. Just maritime records with holes and a curious note in a 14th century Portuguese chronicle referencing men of the cross who carried the silent scripture of the East. By the 18th century, Freemasonry had fully embraced the Templar mythos, and with it, traces of Hermetic language. Lodges spoke of the great architect used the eye of providence and repeated rituals invoking ancient wisdom buried beneath the world. Some rites, particularly in the Scottish Rite, include phrasing nearly identical to Hermetic prayers. One French rite from 1772 mentions the Keeper of Time, who writes upon silver an unmistakable nod to Thoth. Whether these inclusions were symbolic or vestigial, the link had been forged. It's worth noting that Thoth's name never appears outright in these European texts. He is veiled and coded. Perhaps because invoking him directly was considered taboo, or perhaps because they no longer remembered his name, only the idea of him. The scribe, the silent witness, the one who recorded not to reveal but to preserve. Some historians balk at all of this, understandably. There's no direct chain of evidence, no papyrus carried from Hermopolis to Jerusalem to Paris. But there is pattern, there is proximity, and there is motive. The Templars had time, access, and reason to seek out forbidden knowledge. They were not just warriors, they were monks, readers, builders. And the deeper one digs into their history, the stranger it becomes. So did the Templars really uncover the remnants of Thoth's lost science? We may never know. But they behaved as though they had. They vanished as though they had. And in the centuries that followed, secret societies across Europe invoked symbols and scripts that bore the unmistakable fingerprints of the moon god no one dared to name aloud. It begins with green stone and silver letters, a text that claims to have been etched by the hand of Thoth himself long before the sands of Egypt ever knew a pharaoh's name. The emerald tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. A 20th century text so grandiose, so otherworldly, so dripping in mystical prose, it reads less like a document and more like a spell. It's attributed to a man named Maurice Dorel, who claimed not only to have discovered the tablets, but to have translated them from an ancient Atlantean language delivered to him in visions. Reasonable scholars at this point tend to exit the conversation. And yet, the emerald tablets refuse to vanish. Despite their dubious origins and outlandish claims, they've persisted for nearly a century in the corners of esoteric studies, New Age spirituality, and even modern tech subcultures fascinated with simulation theory and quantum mysticism. Why? Because beneath their dizzying metaphors and cosmic riddles, they echo a familiar structure, a voice calling across time, offering knowledge at a price. A scribe who remembers, a keeper of forgotten gates. The text describes Thoth not as a god, but as a king-priest of Atlantis, a civilization lost to flood war or time, depending on the version. He escapes its destruction in a celestial ship, journeys to Egypt, and there seeds a new civilization, teaching humans writing, astronomy, medicine, and sacred architecture. In short, he becomes the father of civilization. Not mythic, not divine, historical. There are no ancient copies, no archaeological corroboration, and the original green crystal tablets Dorel described have never been shown publicly. He claimed they were kept in a hidden temple in the Yucatan. When pressed, he offered only symbolic answers and metaphysical diversions. Still in 1939, he published The Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean, and something strange happened. People recognized the voice. It sounded eerily like the Hermetic Thoth, cryptic, rhythmic, speaking in loops and paradoxes. Man is a flame bound in stone, one tablet reads. Time is the curve through which I walk. Not quite scripture, not quite poetry, but haunting. And some of it, some mirrors themes found in ancient Egyptian texts. The Corpus Hermeticum, for instance, speaks of ascending through planes of light clothed in form. The Book of the Dead describes the soul passing gates guarded by silence, memory, and language. These aren't direct copies, but tonal cousins' songs sung in different languages with the same melody beneath. Even more curious is the recurring symbol in the tablets, the underground chamber. Thoth says he sealed his wisdom beneath the paws of the lion, which once again calls to mind the Sphinx and the Hall of Records mythos. He speaks of vibration, resonance, frequency concepts that would feel entirely out of place in genuine Bronze Age texts, but eerily aligned with modern, speculative physics. That's the trick. The tablets feel too modern for the past, and too ancient for now. They float. Doriel himself is a puzzle. He founded the Brotherhood of the White Temple in Colorado and claimed to channel beings from other realms. His teachings drew from theosophy, Rosicrucianism, and science fiction. Most academics dismissed him as a charlatan, but a few particularly fringe researchers with an interest in cognitive archaeology took a second look. One Dr. Elias Kendrill wrote in a now out-of-print essay that Doriel's writings contained glyphic patterns oddly similar to known Egyptian mnemonic structures. He proposed that Doriel may have unconsciously recreated ancient metaphors through symbolic dreaming, a controversial theory, but not without precedent in studies of mythopoetic cognition. And there's that phrase again. The circuit of memory. It appears in Doriel's tablets just as it did in the Hermopolis fragments and the Hermetic Berlin papyrus. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe these are all branches of a submerged root system sprouting up wherever the soil grows thin. To many, the tablets are nothing more than modern mysticism wrapped in antique ribbon. But others see them as something stranger, not fake, but refracted, a distorted echo of something older, fragmented through time, dream, and myth. After all, the Egyptians believed memory wasn't linear. It could loop, return, inhabit new vessels. What if Thoth's knowledge didn't survive as objects, but as structures, shapes, rhythms, narrative tones that periodically re-emerge through minds attuned to a certain frequency? In that light, perhaps Doriel didn't invent the tablets. Perhaps he received them in whatever way ancient wisdom receives modern minds. Not through proof, through pattern, through dream. Thoth's fingerprints may be smeared across thousands of years, but the pressure of them still lingers. On a shaft wall in Hermopolis, in a mislabeled scroll, in the cadence of an old chant no one remembers how to start. So are the emerald tablets real? If you mean physical artifacts, probably not. But if you mean as a phenomenon, as a continuation of the Thothic narrative in the modern psyche, they're as real as any myth that reshapes minds. And the fact that they surfaced not in Egypt but in America may be the strangest detail of all. Thoth, the moon god, the silent scribe, whispering not from stone halls, but from paperbacks in gas-lit bookstores. What else is buried beneath the noise? You followed the feathers and ink through shifting sands, past crumbled temples and coded scrolls into chambers both physical and imagined. Now the trail begins to bend back on itself, looping into that familiar shape, the curve of the ibis beak, the curl of a question too old to be answered cleanly. Was Thoth ever real, not real like a pharaoh stamped in cartouches? Not real like a ruin charted on maps, but real like a force, a model, an echo carried by culture across millennia. The Egyptians didn't merely invent gods, they channeled archetypes, layered ideas into forms, until the intangible could be sculpted into statues. Thoth wasn't lightning or harvest. He wasn't blood or flood. He was memory. He was the logic behind the ritual. And maybe that made him more dangerous than all the others. We know Thoth appears early in Egyptian thought, and we know his role was central to their metaphysical framework. As timekeeper, as record keeper, as judge, but what strikes you again and again is how portable he became, how easily he migrated. In Hermopolis, he was the moon that counted. In Alexandria, the philosopher who whispered. In Renaissance Europe, he became Hermes Trismegistus, the wise teacher. And in esoteric America, he rose again, Atlantis-bound and crystal-voiced, speaking from the pages of green stone tablets that may never have existed. What do you do with a figure like that? How do you study a god who survives better outside his own temples than within them? Some scholars argue Thoth wasn't a deity at all, at least not originally. That he was modeled after a priestly role or perhaps a series of roles passed down through generations of temple scribes. These men weren't warriors or kings. They were observers. They measured celestial cycles, documented offerings, performed funerary rites, and encoded political shifts in sacred metaphor. They were invisible until they weren't. And some believe one of them, maybe many of them, became the template for what Thoth would become. Not a myth invented by people, but a myth grown from people. The priest remembered not because he ruled, but because he wrote. And that's where things start to blur. Because once you remove the divine glow and look at Thoth as a historical phenomenon, a kind of intellectual lineage, you begin to see patterns that stretch far beyond Egypt. The idea that knowledge must be hidden, that it must be protected, that there are truths too dangerous to speak plainly. The Babylonians had Nabu, the scribe of the gods. The Hebrews had Metatron, the celestial record keeper. The Greeks had Hermes. The Islamic world had Idris. Different names, different robes, but always the same silhouette: the witness, the watcher, the one who writes. It's tempting to lump it all under archetypes, to say that humanity just keeps reinventing the same roles. But with Thoth, there's more than pattern. There's continuity. Specific phrases like language of the stars or circuit of memory keep surfacing across texts that shouldn't know each other. Separated by centuries, by oceans, by alphabets. And yet they speak in mirrored tones. Even modern thinkers feel it. Jung, in his later writings, called Thoth the archetype of the ordering mind. Terence McKenna once claimed Thoth represented the linguistic matrix of being. And even in popular culture, he reappears sometimes as a god, sometimes as a machine, always as a keeper of secrets. He's been cast as a wizard, an alien, an AI, a symbol, never as a man, never as just a man. But what if the truth isn't binary? What if Thoth was both an invention and a keeper, a fictional form that carried very real functions, mathematical systems, astronomical charts, sacred metrics, linguistic scaffolding across civilizations? If so, then Thoth is real, not because he lived, but because he was used. A vessel, a software container for fragile knowledge. His temples may have crumbled, but his utility did not. And maybe that's why the Book of Thoth was always dangerous. Not because it held spells or curses, but because it encoded a mindset that language is power and that knowledge must sometimes hide to survive. That truth can be destroyed unless it's folded into myth, scattered into puzzle pieces, buried under paws of stone, or stitched into emerald dreams. Which brings us full circle back to that scroll from the beginning, found in the vault, inked with a language no one could name. It didn't make claims. It didn't reveal gods. It simply recorded, observed, as if the act of watching itself was sacred. So who was Thoth? Maybe not a being. Maybe not even a belief. Maybe Thoth was a function, a role waiting to be filled. And whoever filled it, scribe, priest, god, or visionary, was sworn to the same vow to remember, even when no one else could. Especially then. So now you find yourself at the end of the trail, though the path hasn't so much ended as it has simply gone quiet. Like sand settling after wind. Like a scroll rolled back up and placed where only time can read it. You've followed Thoth through shifting names and forgotten temples, through stone and silver ink and invention. And yet the question still lingers in the warm silence, like a breath not quite exhaled. What did he leave behind? Not a tomb, not a treasure chest, not even a book, at least, not in the way we understand books. What Thoth may have left behind is harder to touch and far harder to lose. A system, a structure, a rhythm that teaches not just what to think, but how to think. His wisdom was never in the words, it was in how the words were kept, how they were arranged, repeated, protected, buried not to be forgotten, but to be remembered safely. It's easy to laugh at myths from afar, to scoff at the idea of secret halls and crystal tablets. But when you peel back the fantasy, what remains is something stubbornly simple, a belief that memory matters, that the truth has weight, and that someone must carry it even if they vanish in the process. You've seen his footprints now, in the geometry of temples, in the loops of language, in the arc of stories that echo across centuries like a drumbeat trying to be heard. Whether he was a god, a ghost, or just the name of the wind that moves through libraries, Thoth was there, not as a ruler, but as a reminder. And maybe that's what lasts, not the scrolls, not the tablets, but the impulse, the urge to write, to mark, to record even when no one is listening. Especially then, so let the world fall quiet now. Let the sand settle. The moon has risen and the ink has dried. And somewhere in a chamber no one has yet found, the last scribe is still writing, quietly, carefully, as he always did.